On the morning of February 24, 1986, a young man returned home to a condominium in Van Nuys, a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. Inside, he found his wife dead. Her name was Sherri Rasmussen. She was 29 years old. She had been shot 3 times in the chest with a .38 pistol. She and her husband, John Ruetten, had been married for only 3 months. Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957. By the time of her death, she had built a remarkable career. She was a nursing director at a hospital, a woman in her 20s who had already risen to a leadership role in a demanding field. Those who knew her described a person of drive and intelligence, someone whose life was still opening up in front of her. She had a new marriage, a career on the rise, and, by every measure, a future. That future ended in the home she shared with her husband. When investigators first arrived, the scene suggested a violent struggle. There were signs of disorder. And in the earliest phase of the investigation, the Los Angeles Police Department leaned toward a theory that would shape the case for years: that Sherri Rasmussen had interrupted a burglary, that intruders had entered the condominium, and that she had been killed in the confrontation that followed. It was a plausible-sounding explanation. It was also, as later events would prove, a catastrophic misreading of the evidence, because the person responsible was not a stranger, and the case would sit, essentially frozen, for more than 2 decades before anyone in a position of authority truly reckoned with who had been there that day. To understand how that happened, we have to go back before the marriage, back to the University of California, Los Angeles, in the 1970s. It was there that John Ruetten met a woman named Stephanie Lazarus. The two knew each other from their university years. Ruetten would later testify that he and Lazarus had a relationship that involved casual sex, but he was also clear about its limits. Ruetten testified that he never considered Lazarus his girlfriend. Whatever that relationship was or wasn't, it existed in the background as Ruetten's life moved forward. He met Sherri. He married her. And in the years that followed her death, one voice refused to accept the burglary theory that the police had settled on. That voice belonged to Nuys Rasmussen, Sherri's father. In the aftermath of losing his daughter, Nuys Rasmussen urged police to investigate Stephanie Lazarus. At the time, Lazarus was not a stranger to the world of law enforcement. She was a Los Angeles police officer. In 1986, she was a 25-year-old patrol officer, and at the point Nuys Rasmussen was pressing detectives to take a closer look at her, she had already been an officer for 2 years. Imagine the position that put the family in. A grieving father, telling homicide detectives that they should be looking at one of their own, a member of the very department investigating the crime. The suggestion did not take hold. The case stayed classified along the lines investigators had first drawn, and Stephanie Lazarus's career in the Los Angeles Police Department continued. It more than continued. Over the following years, Lazarus rose through the ranks. She was no longer a patrol officer. She became a detective. And by 2009, she had reached an assignment that carried a certain prestige inside the department. She was one of only 2 LAPD detectives focused on high-end art theft. A specialized unit. A trusted role. The kind of position that reflects years of institutional confidence in an officer. All the while, Sherri Rasmussen's murder remained officially unsolved. Her father's suspicion remained unheard, and the physical evidence gathered in 1986 remained where it had been placed, in storage, waiting. That evidence would prove to be the turning point of the entire case. Because in 1986, whoever processed the crime scene had done one thing that mattered enormously. During the attack, there had been a physical struggle, and a bite mark had been left on Sherri Rasmussen's body. Investigators had swabbed it, and that swab, a small biological sample sealed and labeled, had been stored in an evidence room freezer. It stayed in that freezer, undisturbed, from 1986 onward. In 1986, DNA analysis as we now know it did not yet exist as a routine forensic tool. The swab was, in a sense, evidence waiting for a science that hadn't caught up to it. And as the years passed, that science advanced dramatically. What could not be tested in 1986 could be tested later. The case was reopened in 2004. LAPD cold case detectives, going back through the file, discovered the DEA evidence from that bite mark swab, the sample that had been sitting in the evidence room freezer since 1986. This was the thread that could finally unravel everything the original burglary theory had gotten wrong. When the swab was analyzed, it produced a critical result. The DNA recovered from the bite mark did not match a man. It came from a woman. That single fact demolished the long-standing assumption. A killing that had been framed as a burglary gone wrong, presumably committed by male intruders, now carried the biological signature of a female attacker. A female attacker. And in the file, more than 2 decades old, was the name of a woman. A grieving father had begged detectives to investigate all those years ago. A woman who was, by then, a decorated LAPD detective working art theft cases out of the same department. What investigators needed now was a way to compare the DNA from the 1986 swab to Stephanie Lazarus's DNA. But there was an extraordinary complication. Lazarus was an active duty detective. She carried a badge and a gun. She had colleagues, access, and knowledge of how investigations worked from the inside. Approaching her directly or moving too openly risked tipping off the very person they were now scrutinizing. So detectives took a covert route. In 2009, they followed Stephanie Lazarus. According to the case record, they trailed her to a Costco, and there they watched and waited. When Lazarus discarded a drink cup in the trash, detectives collected it. A cup she had used, thrown away in a public place, could yield the DNA they needed, abandoned material, retrieved discreetly, without her knowledge. The DNA from that discarded cup was compared to the DNA from the bite mark swab that had been sitting in the freezer since 1986. And with that comparison, the case that had gone cold for 23 years came roaring back to life. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was arrested. The location of that arrest is one of the most striking details in the entire case. She was taken into custody at the LAPD administrative building in downtown Los Angeles. She was arrested inside the institution she had served for decades by the department she belonged to. A detective, arrested for murder in a police building. Following her arrest, Lazarus was held on $10 million bail. The figure alone signaled the gravity with which the case was now being treated. This was no longer a dusty, cold file. It was a first-degree murder prosecution against a sworn officer of the Los Angeles Police Department. The case moved toward trial, and the trial itself became one of the most closely watched proceedings in Los Angeles. The prosecution built its case on the physical evidence and the history that connected the parties. There was the DNA from the bite mark swab, the sample preserved in the freezer for decades, matched to the sample recovered covertly from the discarded cup. There was the relationship between Lazarus and John Ruetten, the husband of the woman who had been killed, a relationship Ruetten described from the witness stand. Ruetten testified that he and Lazarus had a relationship involving casual sex, and that he had never considered Lazarus his girlfriend. There was the fact that Sherri Rasmussen had been shot with a .38 pistol, and underlying all of it was the manner of death. 3 shots to the chest. In the home Sherri shared with her new husband, in a marriage that was only 3 months old. The defense contested the case, but the weight of the forensic evidence proved decisive. On March 8, 2012, a jury found Stephanie Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder. After 26 years, the death of Sherri Rasmussen had a verdict. The burglary theory that had steered the original investigation was formally, legally, repudiated. And the suspicion that Nuys Rasmussen had voiced in 1986, the suspicion that a police department had not acted on, was vindicated by a jury of 12. Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, a career that had begun with a patrol assignment in the 1980s. And climbed to a specialized detective post, ended with a first-degree murder conviction. Lazarus did not accept the verdict quietly. Her conviction was appealed, but the appeal did not succeed. The California Court of Appeal affirmed the murder conviction on July 13, 2015. In the published decision, People v. Lazarus, the appellate court upheld what the jury had done. The conviction was upheld in 2015, and California's Supreme Court declined to hear any further appeal. In other words, every avenue of review that Lazarus pursued left the verdict standing. She was convicted of first-degree murder, and that conviction has not been vacated, reversed, or overturned. Stephanie Lazarus is incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, and in the years since her conviction, her case has continued to surface in the news through the parole process. In November 2023, a parole board panel recommended that she be granted parole, a development that alarmed and angered many who had followed the case. But that recommendation did not hold. In October 2024, the parole board rescinded the earlier grant, reversing course. Then, in February 2025, Stephanie Lazarus was denied parole again. At that hearing, the presiding commissioner told her she would be eligible for parole in about 3 years. As of the most recent reporting, she remains incarcerated, serving the sentence handed down in 2012. So what does this case leave behind, beyond the verdict and the appeals? It leaves first the memory of Sherri Rasmussen herself, a woman who should be remembered for far more than the way she died. She was 29 years old. She was a nursing director, a leader in her profession, at an age when many are still finding their footing. She had been married for 3 months. She was, by every account, at the beginning of the life she had built for herself. That life was taken in her own home. It leaves, too, a hard set of questions for the institution at the center of it. The person eventually convicted of Sherri Rasmussen's murder was a member of the Los Angeles Police Department. In 1986, the victim's father urged police to investigate that officer, and the department did not pursue it. Instead, for years, the case was understood as a burglary committed by strangers. The theory that guided the original investigation was wrong, and the correct answer, a female attacker whose DNA sat in an evidence freezer, was, in effect, present in the physical evidence the entire time. It simply required the science to advance and the file to be reopened for that truth to be recovered. And that points to the quiet hero of this case, the decision, back in 1986, to swab a bite mark and preserve it, and the discipline of an evidence system that kept that sample intact in a freezer for 18 years until cold case detectives found it in 2004. Without that preserved swab, there is no DNA profile. Without the DNA profile, there is no reason to revisit a name in an old file. Without the covert collection of a discarded cup in 2009, there is no comparison. Each step depended on the one before it, stretching across more than 2 decades. The case of Stephanie Lazarus is often described as the story of a detective who nearly got away with murder. Someone who spent years inside the very system responsible for solving the crime. What ultimately caught up with her was not a confession or a colleague's tip in the immediate aftermath. It was evidence, patiently preserved, and a family that never stopped insisting the first answer had been the wrong one. Sherri Rasmussen's father raised his suspicion in 1986. It took until 2012, a jury verdict of first-degree murder, for that suspicion to be answered in a court of law. Justice, in this case, was not swift, but it did, finally, arrive.